All right, and we are live. So hello to everyone. I guess we can probably give a couple minutes just for anybody who's still about to join, and then we'll get started. And just a reminder to everybody here who's attending. If you have questions, we want this is both an interview session and a Q&A. So if you submit questions in the comment section of YouTube, a selection of those will be passed to me to work into the discussion. All right, so it's 4 o'clock. Sorry, I seem to have a small audio problem. Just give me a second here. All right, there we go. All right, so we can probably get started. A brief introduction for the two of us. My name is Noel. I'm also known as Tilt in the community in the Freedom of Form Foundation. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator among the assorted hats that I wear for the foundation. And so today we're really excited to welcome Dr. Max Moore. Max is a transhumanist philosopher, futurist, and he's the ambassador and president emeritus of Alcor Life Extension Foundation. And interestingly, he was the first to define futurist transhumanism and morphological freedom in the early 1990s, continuing to be a well-known advocate for using science and technology for the enhancement of the human condition beyond ordinary human limitations. His philosophies overlap really well with our organizational mission and conception of freedom of form. And so we're really excited to hear his perspectives. So I think Max is going to give us a little bit of background first, and then we'll jump into some interview questions interspersed with Q&A from the comments on YouTube. So take it away.
Okay, thank you, Noel, and thank you for inviting me here. It's always very interesting for me engaging to talk to new groups and people I haven't really come across before. And as you said, I think there's some interesting connections between the ways of thinking here, so I'd like to explore those. My plan, by the way, for those of you listening, I'm not sure how I usually do things, but I'm just going to give you a little bit of background for a few minutes, and then we're going to make the rest of the session pretty much Q&A. So if you're wondering, who is this guy anyway, and why is he talking to us? My background, in very brief, is that was when I was born. Let's go to 1986 or so, when I was a 22-year-old in England. I started the first cryonics organization in England. So I was pretty hardcore into life extension, medical life extension, from actually my teenage years, which may be a bit of a weirdo to most people around me. People came into my dorm room when I was at Oxford in 1984 to 7 and saw a big box of various drugs for stabilization and a heart-lung machine, and they thought, what the heck is all this stuff? So that was kind of unusual, but I've always been interested in the idea of overcoming limits on the human condition. And to me, life extension was a core part of that, because if you die at whatever today's standard age is, you don't really get enough chance to explore who you could be. So that's kind of how it got started. Then I moved to the States in 1987 to work on my PhD at USC, and I started a magazine in 88 called Extra Bee. which was kind of a metaphor for the opposite of entropy. Whereas entropy is the tendency of a closed system to move towards disorder and decay, entropy was not meant as a technical term, but more of a metaphor for openness, expansion, improvement, increasing intelligence, increasing diversity, and so on. So it was a term that encapsulated my interest in things like moving out into space, getting beyond the limits of Earth's gravity well, extending the lifespan, orbiting human intelligence, being able to refine our emotions, and many other things like that. So it's kind of a single word that encapsulated that quite well. I worked on my doctoral dissertation, finally getting it finished off in 1995, and the theme of that has got the typical kind of doctoral title of the diachronic self: identity, continuity, and transformation. So this was in philosophy, and my focus really was an age-old question: what makes you who you are? What makes you the person you are over time? Given that, obviously, if you compare yourself now to when you were 5 years old, or 2 months old, or how you'll be when you're 90, they might seem very different. And some people said, well, in what sense are you the same person? So I kind of looked at that in great detail. It's a topic that gets discussed an awful lot among transhumanists, not surprisingly. And I based my work largely on that of Derek Parfit, who wrote a really brilliant book called Reasons and Persons. And I essentially adopted his view, which is kind of a continuation of John Locke and other people's views, that your identity is not really defined by your body or by the particular matter your body is made of, because obviously that changes over time from periods of a few hours to a few years. Your matter changes over. It's not really the physical structure of your body, although that can certainly affect the way you express your personality. So I kind of dug into that, and I dug into questions of what kind of changes can you make to the self, and under what conditions before losing your sense of self. I mean, if you think about a case where you're having a car accident and you smash your head against something and you come out totally changed in personality, there's a real question that maybe you're not the same person that you were before in some important sense. Then I also had a big chapter, one of my 4 chapters, on the concept of death. When does the self end? Arguing it's not really when we argue it is today. Potentially, we have these different kinds of death, like clinical death and legal death and medical death, and then there's really the final kind of death, information theoretic death, the point beyond which it's not really possible for any technology to bring you back. So that's kind of the whole area that I studied. So really, the idea of what makes you who you are and how can you change yourself is fascinating to me. While developing that thinking, I was always really a transhumanist without knowing what to call it until I came up with that term. And I have to know that historically a couple of people have actually used that term before me, but I'd never heard of them before that. You can go back and find, Dante used it in some sense, and Julian Huxley actually the closest meaning, although not quite the same. I hadn't read any of those before, but I certainly had a transhuman from FM 2030, another futurist, but he hadn't really used the term transhumanism. Perhaps it appealed to me as a philosopher to have an ism there. And in developing transhumanism, which I'll talk a little bit about, I was kind of influenced. There were different flavors of transhumanism, and personally I was kind of influenced by Nietzsche to some extent. Now, Nietzsche says a lot of different things, and sometimes they contradict each other, or at least appear to. My particular interest in him was really his idea that we are not the last word in evolution. Human beings are not the last word. He said basically we're a bridge between the ape and the Superman. And by that, he didn't mean what the Germans then perverted it to mean. He really meant something beyond the limits of human beings. And he talked about the importance of choosing a self, not of being yourself, but of choosing a self, because you get to develop who you are over time. But in my view, the existentialists talk about choosing who you are at every moment. The problem with their view is that they don't have the technological means to do that right now. You can't just will yourself to be totally different. You can try, you can maybe gradually make some progress, but you have a basic personality that's really hard to change. And if you're born kind of wimpy and scrawny, you're not going to win Mr. Olympia. It doesn't matter how many steroids you take right now. So until you can make some basic changes in your biology and neurology, there are limits there, but those limits will shift over time, and that was the idea. So that was kind of my trajectory, really, of being interested in creating a self, extending the self, and exploring all the possibilities of the self. I don't want to overlap any of the. Noah has a great set of questions which cover pretty much everything I was going to say. So just a little bit about transhumanism. For those of you who are not that familiar with the idea, my sort of 101 version of transhumanism is you can think of transhumanism as transhumanism or as transhumanism. Now, what I mean by that is the transhumanism part basically means it's an extension of the humanist tradition, in the sense that humanists kind of rejected the authority of religion and any popes and authorities like that, and said we have to rely on reason human reason and creativity driven by goodwill, and that progress was possible. We're not doomed to live in a miserable world, and we should in fact try to improve things. And also an emphasis on humans, not any particular group, that we should all, all share in that future. So transhumanism went beyond that because the humanists kind of got stuck on human. I actually wrote a piece for Free Inquiry magazine, which at least back then in the early 90s was the leading humanist magazine, on how transhumanism differed. And it's interesting, half the audience were really hostile and the other half were really interested. So I kind of split there, but I still stuck on what is human. Well, the question really is why should we be limited by whatever human is, even if it's biological, if we can start to change that? And we can talk about some of those possible changes. So that's kind of the basic idea of transhumanism. It involves this idea of morphological freedom, which we'll discuss, which I think would be of interest to you. It includes the idea of basically questioning all limits on the human condition. Just because they've been there for a long time doesn't mean they have to be. Just like, pretty much every culture had slavery for a long time. It was just what you did. We don't all consider that acceptable. To take, a pretty obvious example. So I think that's probably all I need to say to begin with. I think we'll cover pretty much everything else as we go along, thanks to Noah's really good set of questions.
Cool, thank you so much. So I think one of the first questions that is going to be on our minds is, while there's a great deal of hope that comes from the promise of transhumanism and what that future could look like, there's a set of people who are in a way naysayers, in the sense that they criticize this kind of modification as being unnatural or immoral, or possibly even technologically impossible. So how do you react to those naysayers who criticize transhumanism as being unnatural or in some kind of negative light?
Well, yeah, there's a whole bunch of different objections, really. The unnatural one I just find kind of a little bit silly. What is natural for human beings? If you mean by natural something that is part of nature without human beings, then I guess we're going to have to go back to the caves, not have any fire, just live in animal skins, and that's pretty much it. That's natural. But that's kind of ridiculous, right? I mean, beavers build dams, so you can't say that dams are unnatural. That's part of what being a beaver is. And to me, a core part of being a human, and this comes from humanism, is the idea that we are questioning beings, we're creating beings, we build and create and develop things, and we question things. So what's natural to humans is precisely to change the world. That's what we've done a lot, and we continue to do. And now we're just beginning to develop the technological means to change our internal nature through genetic alterations, neurological alterations, and so on. So how can it be unnatural for us to do what's really what makes us human in the first place? So that one I find kind of lazy thinking in a sense. It's the naturalistic fallacy, really, that says what is natural is good. Well, it really isn't. If natural is good, why on earth are you taking vaccines to murder that poor coronavirus vaccine? It's perfectly it's perfectly natural, so leave it alone. Obviously, not all of nature is good. It's actually quite neutral. It's up to us to define what parts of nature we want to enhance.
That makes a lot of sense. So I want to pivot a little bit to some of your background in one aspect of transhumanism, which is life extension, which is to transcend our mortality in a sense. And so you've, as you've mentioned, worked much of your career with Alcor Life Extension Foundation, having led them for many years, and now being the President Emeritus, I believe, there. So the question that I think we all have is, how did you approach leadership of Alcor? How did it come to be as an organization? And have you encountered interesting technological roadblocks that you were able to overcome along the way?
Oh boy, that's quite a lot. Okay.
It's a dense question.
So when did it come to be? Well, it actually came to be in 1972. We're actually in our 50th year right now, and we're planning to have a big Alcor 50 conference next year in June. February will actually be 50. So we've been around for a long time. It was started by Fred and Linda Chamberlain. Fred was literally a rocket scientist, and he didn't like the idea of dying, and he kind of read about this idea. It was just getting started back in the late 60s, and he and Linda started Alcor, and it's still, it's really the leading organization still today. I took the job because, as I said, I've been interested in life extension for a long time, But by the time the job came up, I was well into my 40s, and I wasn't seeing much progress going on in life extension. I'd been following it since I was a teenager, and not a whole lot seemed to be really happening. There was some interesting new theories, interesting possible approaches, but basically we hadn't found a way of breaking the human maximum lifespan yet. And I'm hoping that's going to change. There's a lot more interest in it these days. There's a lot more funding. The VCs are sniffing around looking for opportunities. Google has a big research thing, which we don't know anything about. We don't know if it's a complete failure or if it's doing interesting stuff. Jeff Bezos has now got a new company, Alcor, with others. So we don't know what's going to happen, but I'm pretty cautious these days. Now I'm 57. I don't know how much longer I have, hopefully at least 30 years. But I figure I may not make it to the time when we can actually control the aging process. So what's my option? Well, I really don't like being shoved in the ground and munched on by worms and bacteria. That just sucks. Or being shoved into an oven and incinerated, that sucks too. So my third option is, okay, when I'm clinically dead, which doesn't mean I'm actually really dead, it just means my heart stopped and my breathing has stopped, I want to be cryopreserved and have the cells protected against ice formation in the possibility that the future may have more advanced technology that can reverse whatever killed me in today's sense and repair and rejuvenate me. So that seems like the better option. So when it turned out that the job was available, that they needed someone to take over as CEO, at first I thought, oh my goodness, that's a lot of responsibility. But I finally took the job and moved from Austin, where I was living at the time, here in Scottsdale, Arizona, and took that on. And my goal really was to treat, really the Alcor tradition, to treat cryonics as an evidence-based practice. We're not just here to hope it works and to pretend it works and to not really know if it works or not. We want to know how well it's working, or if it's not working, then you look for an alternative, and to make it work better. So one of the first things to talk about technological obstacles, well, there's a number of those. One, of course, that people always bring up but don't really understand how it works is the problem of ice formation when you cryopreserve people. People often hear, even people who should know better, like Michio Kaku, the popular physicist, he did a YouTube video to which I did a rebuttal. You might want to check that online, where he repeated the same mistake, that when you go below the freezing point, ice forms inside the cells and expands and kind of blows them up. And that's just not what happens. Even if you don't protect them, that's not what happens. If it did, you wouldn't better cryopreserve embryos and sperm and eggs and skin and heart valves and all the other things we do cryopreserve. That wouldn't be possible. What actually happens is that cells dehydrate and ice forms between the cells if you don't protect them. And that causes some damage, but nothing like blowing them up. But at Alcor, for a long time, we've been using various solutions, originally based on glycerol solutions, that will protect against ice formation. And around the year 2000 or so, 2001, we started applying a technique called vitrification, so instead of, we don't actually literally freeze these days, we vitrify. And that comes from the Latin word for glass. So what that means is the solution that replaces the blood and other fluids becomes more and more viscous and holds the cells in place without any ice crystal formation. And we know that we can cryopreserve embryos and other tissues by that method and bring them back. We're on the verge of being able to do whole human organs. Not quite there yet. There's been some success with rabbit kidneys. But maybe in the next few years we'll be able to cryopreserve human organs, keep them in a hospital, take them out as needed, rather than losing tens of thousands of lives a year because you can't find a tissue match. So, the most important part to preserve is the brain. So I think we're pretty close to doing that. And we're continuing to look at ways of improving this process and making it more reversible. And one of the things I started on, like a couple of years after I started, was I want to know how well are we doing this right now? Because you can't really see inside the skull. So we discovered that actually we could do CT scans of our neuro patients in liquid nitrogen. And the aluminum cans they're in are actually transparent to CT rays. So now we have all these studies of cryopreserved brains, and we can show which ones look really good and which ones not so good, and start learning how to do better. So there's really a lot of different technological areas, and we're doing a lot of research right now, but that's just some of the high points.
That's very exciting to hear. So we have a few interesting Q&A questions that have come through in the comments spinning off of this. So one of the first ones is currently, despite cryonics having a good technological basis and being a really interesting method which is becoming more and more well established, it's still a relatively niche area, and there's a relatively small number of people who probably are even aware of it, or more than that, would consider it as something that they would want to pursue. So the question that was posed is, how do we normalize cryonics in a way that makes it more accessible, I think, to the public at large?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's one I wrestle with all the time. It's incredibly frustrating to me that there are so few of us after several decades. And that's a big question. Why are there so few, and what can we do about it? I actually gave a talk at the Bill conference. I don't know if you know the Bill conferences. They kind of used to be on the side of the TED conferences, TED and Bill. And I gave a talk called "Join the 0.0004%." So I try to make a virtue of the fact that it was so uncommon. But it is kind of crazy to me that we don't have far more members at this point. And I do think that will change. I do imagine at some point in the future this will be normal. It'll be something that hospitals have cryonics units to begin the process. And this will be obvious. People will scratch their head as to why we didn't do this earlier, just as we do now with even things like antisepsis, which took decades to take off. It's ridiculous now that how many people died because people weren't washing their hands and using antisepsis. That's very different. That's kind of an interesting example because you can compare that to painkillers, which caught on very quickly. And you think, well, why did antisepsis take decades, whereas painkillers was really quick? Well, I think it's clear that there's a very clear benefit on both sides to painkillers. If you're having a leg chopped off, you want something to dull the pain. If you're the surgeon trying to hold them down while you cut the leg off, you also want the same thing. So there's a very clear incentive to adopt that. Whereas antisepsis is kind of invisible, you can't see it. And cryonics is not quite the same, but has some major obstacles in the sense that, first of all, it really upsets people's fundamental beliefs about life and death, right? It questions what is death exactly, at what point do you really die, at what point you're recoverable, and things that challenge people at a fundamental level make them very uncomfortable. And then it's even worse than that because in giving our answer to that as a possibility, we don't offer any certainty. We don't say, look, sign up for us and we guarantee you'll come back and everything will be great. We don't do that because that will just be dishonest. We can't make those guarantees. We can't absolutely guarantee the technology will actually happen, although we think it's plausible. We can't guarantee, the government won't ban us or someone will blow us up. There's all kinds of things that could happen. And people don't want to hear that. They want to hear, look, okay, I accept this belief system. I sign up for this. I'm going to go to heaven or whatever. That's what they want. They want certainty. Or if they don't think that's possible, they want to be certain they're dead and that's it. I don't have to worry about it anymore. They have to settle their mind one way or another. And that's one big problem with human nature is we like certainty. And we don't offer certainty. We offer a lot of uncertainty. Plus, you think about, okay, I'll come back in the future. How many people do I know? Will my skills be outdated? What will I do for a living? That scares the hell out of most people. So our members tend to be a little unusual and they're more adventurous, experimental. They say, actually, I like to quote Larry King here, who expressed interest in cryonics, but unfortunately didn't follow through. And on one of his shows, someone asked him, well, Larry, you won't have any friends. He went, I'll make new friends. Which I think is a perfectly decent answer if you can't convince your friends to come with you. So that's some of the reasons I think that people don't do this. Plus, I've seen, over the years, so many people say, I want to do this, but just never get around to it because they have to make contracts and provide funding and all this stuff. It's not that simple. It's kind of like getting a mortgage, basically. It's kind of probably at least as difficult as that, although we're trying to simplify things and automate sign-up. But those are some of the reasons. I do think that once people understand that death isn't quite what they think it is. I was just reading something this morning where someone wrote a blog on this morning, and it was just wrong again. He said he was calling these medical students idiots because they talk about clinical death. He said, well, clinical death, he just misunderstood what it meant. Clinical death is not death. Clinical death means your breathing has stopped, your heart has stopped. That doesn't mean all your cells have suddenly instantly died. We have different standards over time. People used to stop breathing, or breathing was not detectable, but they actually were not dead, and that's where we get the bells that people used to put on graveyards, because people were actually buried alive, not uncommonly, and they actually started putting bells there. You could pull on a cord to say, I'm not dead yet, I'm not dead yet. That's in Monty Python. So, when are you really dead? It's not when your heart stops beating, because that's clinical death, but that's reversible, and we do it all the time now. And not just from 5 minutes. That idea that your brain's dead after 3 to 5 minutes without oxygen is really not true. That's under certain conditions. There are people being brought back after 3/4 of an hour for an hour or more of clinical death, no brain activity, no blood flow. And those are people who have been fall into very cold water, slow down the metabolism, and they've been carefully rewarmed. So we know it's not a sharp line like that. And our view is, so long as the brain structure is intact that preserves your memory and personalities, there is the possibility that one day we can repair that damage and revive you. Now, that's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen next year. It's going to take some decades at least, and nobody knows exactly how long, but it seems like a pretty plausible bet. But death is not what people think, and that will lead to some other questions maybe later as to different platforms for the human being rather than biological body.
So it sounds like also that some of the doubt that people have coming from the uncertainty that comes from cryonics is if you aren't certain of how you might be thawed or brought back, what is the assurance, at least, that there's a technological basis that it's going to work? I think a lot of people have some doubts that it's even possible to begin with. So, I guess the question is, could you speak briefly on some of the initial indications, whether those be animal studies or your own internal Alcor studies, that lead you to believe that there's at least a decent likelihood that this will work?
Right. I think there's two main aspects to this. First of all, you need to be able to demonstrate that under the conditions that we have today, the procedures we have today, that we are actually sufficiently preserving neural structure in a way that is, then potentially viable in the future. And the second big thing is, which we can't really do definitively today because it's not today, you have to be able to show that there's some plausible belief that it will be possible to repair people and revive them in the future. So these are two different things. And I mentioned the CT scans. That's part of the first aspect of this, that we can actually show that in many cases we are preserving the brain pretty well. We've either eliminated or minimized ice formation. We've done some studies, actually, hopefully a paper will be out sometime early next year. We did it on one patient, a special case, where we actually took brain samples and did not just electron microscopy, but differential scanning, calorimetry, and a whole bunch of other scanning tests. And from what I understand, the results are really good. This is a specially done case. The brain structure is fantastic. You can see everything is preserved. The neurons are intact, the connections are intact. Everything we know about the biology of memory, which is not complete, suggests that we have actually preserved that pretty well. Now, that's not always the case. It depends on the circumstances and possible delays. But that means that we can at least show now that it's pretty plausible what matters has been preserved. But okay, you say, well, okay, fine, but how do we know you can ever bring that back in the future? That requires some kind of magical technology. Well, my answer is it doesn't really, because if you think about what nature already does, it's pretty amazing. And it's a matter of us learning to control it. Right now, if you think about where did you come from, if you didn't know this, and I told you this, it would seem insane, but we all know it's true. You came from a single fertilized cell, and they became trillions of cells. You became this thing. How is that possible? That seems magical, right? Well, not really, but it's an extremely complex process, obviously. Certain animals can regenerate limbs. We can't do that. We're pretty crappy at it. When you're an embryo, you can actually regenerate a lot better. Then you lose that ability as your genes start to differentiate more. You can cut off the tip of a finger, and you can probably regenerate just the tip. The liver can regenerate a little bit. That's about it. So we're really crappy at that, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn to regenerate things. In fact, we've already started to grow organs in the lab. We're at the stage of proto-organs right now. And it's very plausible to think it won't be too long before we can regenerate limbs and other tissues quite regularly. So that would certainly help what we're doing. And if we can show that you can actually cryopreserve human organs reversibly, I think that makes it extremely plausible, because the brain, the most important part of the body, is an organ. I'm of the view, as some other future thinkers say, that anything which doesn't contradict the laws of physics should one day be achievable. At least if you say it's impossible, the onus is on you to show why it's impossible. Because if physics doesn't rule it out, why shouldn't we do it? Okay, so if physics says we can't do time travel, then okay, we can't do time travel unless we find some interesting workaround that doesn't violate the laws of physics. But tissue repair doesn't violate laws of physics. It happens all the time. We're talking about guiding it. And in fact, it's interesting because just this morning I was checking in with Robert Freitas, who's written 2 books on nanomedicine, basically the use of nanoscopic devices to repair tissue. He has a new book coming out that Alcor actually funded the work on. It ended up being not a paper, but an 800-page book with like 3,000 references exactly on this issue of how do you repair cryopreserved patients. And he's kind of the world's expert on that. So, again, we can't prove this will work, but my view is really, it seems plausible. There are mechanisms we can see. We can point to extensions of current research. And anyone who says it's impossible really needs to say why. I remember being on a TV show quite a few years ago, and this guy was a professor of surgery who was kind of mocking me, trying to make fun of it. He says, what you're talking about is like trying to jump from here to the moon. And I try to point out, actually, no, it's not at all like that, because that violates laws of physiology and physics and all kinds of other things. That's just a stupid analogy. So there's a lot of very weak arguments like that.
That makes a lot of sense. So we have a number of questions that stem from this discussion. I won't be able to cover them all because I'm just being conscious of time, and there's some other really cool things that we want to talk about today. But One of them that I will ask is one person wants to know what life extension plan do you favor? And I guess that's in the sense of both in current life, prior to cryopreservation. What do you think is some of the most promising avenues for life extension currently in the field?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I keep my mind pretty much open because things change all the time, and I don't really know what the best approach will be. I don't think things like telomerase therapy look very promising these days, or that might be part of an answer. I'm quite sympathetic to the Aubrey de Grey's approach of basically looking at 7 different processes by which bodies age and break down. It's largely a process of entropy in various different ways. And his approach is not to worry so much about having a grand theory of aging, but rather to tackle those processes where things are falling apart and figure out how to stop them and reverse them. So I think that's one promising approach. But I don't necessarily want to rule out other approaches. There are people who believed in programmed aging, that evolution has somehow selected us to just suddenly age at a certain point and die off to make room for the next generation. There are a number of different theories. So I don't know which one will ultimately turn out to be true. I do think that one thing I like to say about aging is, going back to the issue of what's natural and what's moral, there's nothing sacred about aging or the age we die at. As I like to point out, unless you're a fundamentalist, it's pretty clear that we evolved into our current form, and that aging is a result of evolution, because evolution's goal, Richard Dawkins' term, it's about selfish replicators, selfish genes. They're only interested in quotes, of course, in passing on to the next generation. And once you've passed reproductive age, they don't really give a crap about you. You can go off and age and die because you've already passed to the next generation. So we're not selecting for very long life there. And you can look at that across different ecological niches and see how that explains some of the variation in lifespan. So there's nothing special about that. If the question is more about what can you do right now rather than sort of theoretical approaches, I honestly don't think there's a whole lot of really interesting stuff you can do. I think there are a few things. Unfortunately, the difficult answer is still, if you want to minimize your chances of dying early at least, it's still all about exercise and diet. Sorry, but it's still hard work. So you've still got to do that. But I think there are some very interesting things. I was actually in a clinical trial, which looks like we'll get going again soon, back in 2016, I think, run by Greg Fay, who's also a cryobiologist, but also very interested in gerontology. And he looked at research on the past into thymus regeneration. Thymus up here is basically responsible for your T cells and a lot of your immune system, something that people should be very interested in right now. And once you reach adulthood, it gradually atrophies over time until you're about 60, it's basically a lump of useless fat, and you're just living on old T cells and not really regenerating. And Greg found that there was research showing that in some animals, they either they were able to regenerate the thymus with growth hormone, or they could transplant fresh ones, and they found the immune system was vastly boosted, it was rejuvenated. And then he saw there was more research doing that with AIDS patients. So he thought, well, what about doing it with healthy, normal males to start with? And so I was part of the first trial of 10 or 12 of us. I was actually patient number 1. And we spent a year getting injected with human growth hormone along with some other factors to mitigate the rise in insulin. And after we actually finished, the samples, well, first of all, it seemed to work pretty well. We actually had to have scans done at Stanford Medical School to look at our thymus glands, and the cortex, the part that does the real work, did seem to be rejuvenated, so hopefully that did work. But also, along came Steve Horvath, who's one of the leading, well, maybe the leading person in aging clocks. He's constantly innovating in aging clocks and looking at what biological markers relate really to fundamental aging. And which is very important, because if you're doing life extension research, you can't really wait 50 years to see what worked. You need something that works a little more quickly. And Greg gave him some of these samples, and he looked at them, and he said that our basic biological age reversed by maybe a year or year and a half over that year. So we ended up actually biologically younger. And what was interesting was that pretty much all took place in the last 3 months. So I think one goal of the next round, which I want to be involved with, sure, is to let's extend that, maybe do this for 18 months or 2 years and see if that sticks and if it actually it goes even further. So that's kind of an exciting one, because the immune system obviously is very important to not dying young. That won't get you to live past the human maximum, which right now the world record holder is 122, so that's the one to beat, and she's actually well ahead of number 2. There are things like NAD therapy that some people are excited about. I'm not that enthused about it. I think we're still waiting for the real breakthrough. So right now it's about not dying early and keeping your brain and body healthy. I don't think we have a magical answer. It did look promising for a while, and I was a good friend of Roy Walford at UCLA, who pioneered a lot of the caloric restriction experiments. And he was a big fan of that and thought that could actually extend our lives to maybe 150. But it turns out that's actually very relative to the lifespan of the animal, or actually maybe more to the summer-winter feeding cycle, and that short-lived organisms, you can extend their lives massively by calorie restriction, 100% or more. But as you move up the chain, you find that they did this NIH with apes. They got a rather small extension, pretty good increase in health, but it doesn't do very much. It might give you 2 or 3 more years and more health. But if you take it too drastically, the problem is you get fragile. And what people don't often consider is these were laboratory animals in cages, well maintained. We're in the real world. Even today, we have to go out to the real world. You may have an accident, you may get COVID, go to hospital. If you're very scrawny, you don't have much extra resources to live on. So going to an extreme with caloric restriction probably isn't worth it given the limited benefits. So my unfortunately somewhat downer view is there's not a whole lot you can do other than working hard, exercise and diet, and keep an eye out for these new developments. But I think immune rejuvenation looks quite promising at this point.
That's very exciting. So there's one more question that I think we'll cover before moving on to some more questions. I apologize to other people who have asked questions that we won't have time to cover in this session. So this question is about the brain being the most important thing to preserve and continue. So the question is, how do you feel about extending the runtime or expiration date of the brain or consciousness rather than the whole body, which I guess ties into the neuro option in Alcor?
Yeah, well, I think they kind of go together. And let me just explain that among Alcor members, about half our members are signed to preserve the whole body and half just the brain, which in practice means leaving it in the skull for practical reasons. I'm one of the people who's always chosen just the neuro option, as we call it, because my view is that any kind of technology that can repair the aging process, which obviously we need to do, we're not going to bring you back as an old person just to conk out again. If you have that kind of technology that can fix aging, cancer, heart disease, all the other issues that could be deadly, and rejuvenate the cells and repair everything, that kind of technology will be able to regenerate a body pretty easily by comparison. I mean, fixing the brain with 86 billion neurons is going to be a big job and require something like nanotechnology. Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe if we can preserve you well enough, it might not require that level of technology. But we're already starting to see, as I mentioned earlier, the ability to regenerate body parts and organs. So I think we're going to do that a lot sooner than we can repair a brain. So that's why I'm not concerned about being a Futurama brain on a floating pad or something. I don't think that's going to be the way. I mean, when you come back, we can speculate as to the options. When you're revived, they might kind of wake you up part way and say, hey, look, we've got some options you might not have considered. We can either bring you back as you expected at your best, your physical peak and best, or we've got these cool new cyborg bodies that you might want to try out. Who knows what the options are? But our kind of base scenario is that, well, we'll regenerate the body, and basically, all your cells contain the full complement of DNA, so you just need to support the brain and regenerate a body downwards. I don't think it'll be through cloning. I mean, in principle, you could clone a body, a decerebrated clone, transplant the brain, but I think it's more likely to be actually regeneration of the body. So to me, it doesn't really matter if you're neuro or body, you're going to end up the same, I believe.
Makes sense. So I think...
But again, just to follow up, I say the brain's the most important because you can't have a brain transplant. If you get someone else's brain, it's not you, it's them. Everything else is replaceable. The brain is the one thing you can't replace right now.
Makes sense. That sounds like it answers the question. So I think for now, we'll pivot away from cryonics and towards some other aspects of transhumanism. So I'm going to ask about actually in the 90s, you coined a term called morphological freedom as a central idea in transhumanism. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what the term means to you, how you define it, and why you think it's important to transhumanism.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of inconsistent thinking about personal freedoms regarding the body. We see a lot of people arguing for one kind of freedom, but not another. Some people want to ban drugs, but want to allow gay sex or whatever. I mean, there's one thing okay and one thing that's not okay. To me, it's the same principle. It's your body. Nobody else has a right to interfere with what you do with your body, other than clearly the proviso you don't use it to harm other people. So, the right of me to swing my fist, send at your face, and so on. But apart from that, really, I don't believe in things like drug laws. I don't believe in people banning cosmetic surgery or people dressing up how they want or getting sex changes. Whatever I might think of any of those personally, I think those are things that everybody should have a right to. And that's because of the fundamental right of self-ownership. You own your body. Nobody else does. You're the one who's responsible for it. So you should be making those choices and learn to be responsible for it. And we shouldn't be imposing. I mean, basically, when you stop people exercising that freedom, people learn to be infantile. They don't learn responsibility, and things get pretty bad. So I think we need a general principle that you have this right of autonomy over your body. And that includes the more radical form, and morphological freedom expresses that, but includes the ability to modify your body in quite drastic ways. I mean, already we have people who do make all kinds of alterations to the body and do things with their ears and their nose and so on. And of course, tattoos have been around forever. So there are even more radical versions of that, where you may want to have different limbs, whether they're biological, when that's possible, or cybernetic limbs. You might even want to change your appearance so radically that you don't even appear human, and people freak out about that. But I think those are things that everybody should have a right to do, and I think it's important to establish that right early on. That includes the right not to have things done to you. Very importantly, this is a negative right. It's a freedom right. It's not a right to have someone else pay for you to have a procedure. It's your right for you to do it yourself without interference. And that also means that we can't have governments or other people telling you what you can do with your babies. They can't tell you how to design the babies. That should be up to you. They can't tell you what kinds of augmentations are allowed and what are not. And we're a very long way from that in any country, but certainly in this country, the FDA have tremendous power over what things we can do, and they've expanded that power over time. So it's really a fundamental idea that this is a negative right to be free of interference, to be allowed that choice, and to learn to be responsible for that. So whether it's not just physiological changes, but also neurological changes. And of course, we do that already to some extent with antidepressants and anti-anxiety treatments. People who are burdened with these issues, and I've struggled with depression myself, I know what that's like, we should be free to try and fix that. And right now, our methods are very crude. We use these drugs that are not that well targeted. It'd be a lot better if we could actually find out what's going on in the brain and change its expression of the genes, or we produce our own neurochemistry properly without the side effects. But you can imagine that there would be some pretty drastic changes. Someone might want to really change the way their brain works in the future. There's a really good novel by what's his name? He's an Australian science fiction writer. I'm forgetting his name right now. His first book was called Quarantine. He's written some very interesting stuff after that. But one thing I liked about this was he talked about neurotechnologies in the book, and his character kind of argued that the most interesting thing about these neurotechnologies, ways of modulating your brain, were not the creation of exotic new mental states. It was the ability to focus. And the main character is a private detective, and he could actually switch his brain so that if he had to stalk someone out, he could just totally focus on one thing for as long as it took without getting distracted. Other people could tune themselves to be extremely creative and produce new music or new writing, basically able to select those mental states. Because right now, sometimes you need to get down to work, but you think, oh God, I really wish I could have sex right now, and just start thinking about that, or oh, I wish I could eat some food right now. It'd be nice if you could decide to tune those up or down at various times. So I'm not just talking about kind of bodily changes, but neurological changes, emotional alterations, and yes, that certainly raises a lot of issues. We want to be careful about that. But I think, again, we evolve these characteristics, both a lot of pretty bad characteristics, a lot of tribalism is good at evolutionary. We have a very hard time getting beyond us and them, and that's something I think we can modify that culturally, but I think it's still there in our genes, and to really do away with that or make progress, we're going to have to make some fundamental changes at some point. But personal changes, not something forced on people.
I want to segue that actually into a question of how this applies to our organization, the Freedom of Form Foundation. And so for us, we advocate for what we call freedom of form, which ties in very well with the concept of morphological freedom. And we define that as being the right to expression of the self through total biological self-determination, even if the goal is a form that substantially deviates from traditional human anatomy, including non-human anatomies. So I guess the question is to explicitly ask, do you see your conception of morphological freedom as including these kinds of radically different morphologies that deviate very substantially from human anatomy? And also, had you been previously aware of people who wanted to do this?
It does include that right, certainly. And again, to stress that this is a negative right, that doesn't mean that if you want to look radically different, just today, some people might want to dress in radically different ways. That doesn't mean you have a right to work at a job where people accept that, because they have rights too. But it does mean that there can't be any general banning of that or an oppression of people who want to do that. I haven't been aware of your organization until recently, but obviously there's a lot of different subcultures that probably have aspects of this. There are the people with tattoos again that become quite popular again, piercings and various body modifications. There's the whole biohacking area that I'm obviously interested in too. I gave a talk over in Finland a few years ago. It was very interesting. So that's all kind of part of this. And then, of course, I know people who want to dress up in various ways to look like non-humans. And that can also, of course, be done virtually online. You can have a virtual persona. But in the future, you might actually be able to actually physically change your body, either permanently or temporarily, to express more, to grow gills or a tail or fur or whatever. And yeah, I absolutely think that should be each person's right. The only thing I think could not, is dangerous, and that you maybe have to have some very careful rule against. Again, your right to your freedom has to be equal to other people's rights. So there was a novel, I can't remember the author, but it was basically a sequel to Blade Runner, and not the same as the second movie that came out. And the character in there had something done to his brain so that he had no fear, and he would get more and more, build more and more rage, sort of the opposite of what you normally do. Anything that would make you calm would make him more angry. Well, that's not the kind of thing we probably would allow, because that's extremely dangerous. That'd be like someone driving drunk at 150 miles an hour. So I think there'll be kind of limits like that. But that's pretty obvious stuff, I think. So long as it's not something that's clearly directly threatening harm to people. Feelings are not, and I know this is unpopular to say these days, but feelings are not. Being offended is not a form of harm, in my view. I think it's just a lot of bullshit here. People say, "Oh, my feelings are offended because you said some word that, it's hurt me because you said this word." Bullshit. Get over it and grow up. I don't understand how they can say that, but also say, "Oh, we have to accept, say, gay people or trans people." Well, what about the people who are offended by that? It's inconsistent. So, we have to be accepting of each other. It doesn't mean you have to necessarily agree with it or think that's a good idea, but you have to be able to accept it and treat people with respect. So if someone wants to look like a cat or an alien or whatever, that's fine. And I think we have the right to do that, and we have to learn to live with that. I think it's interesting. We can do that clearly, and that's actually kind of amazing. People talk about how we are not accepting of people, but in some ways it's amazing how much progress we've made in a short period of time. If you think historically, let's just take being gay for instance. But historically, that was something nobody could speak about for a long time. It's kind of known in subcircles, but basically you probably get killed for most of human history. And then starting in the 60s, it's just started to get going, and then within just a very few decades, it's become totally accepted, and the TV shows and everything. And now we're seeing the same happening with transgender people in an incredibly short period of time. So I think that gives us some hope that actually we can learn and become more accepting.
That's very encouraging to hear. So I want to segue this into another aspect that spins off of morphological freedom, which is a related term that you coined in the same essay where you coined that term, which is transbiomorphosis, where you propose to describe a process of creating rationally engineered improved bodies by intervening in and or replacing existing biological processes. And in that same point, you predicted that the technologies of transformation, that's a quote, will come to exist in the decades to come. So I wanted to ask if you could elaborate on what you had in mind when developing the concept of transbiomorphosis, and in practical terms, how do you envision such a process taking place?
Yeah, so I could have already maybe hinted that a little bit in terms of the biological technologies we're starting to develop, and which could use not just for repair, but for changes to the body, transformations of the body. I think we're seeing this coming along quite rapidly now. It's a very kind of simple form of this is in choosing babies, basically, designer babies, as the term has come to be. We're seeing some very interesting things like PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, And we actually know some people at the park who are perfectly kind of normal conservative couple, but they actually chose which embryo to implant. They had IVF, looked at the embryos, chose which one seemed to be lacking any kind of problematic characteristics, and that's the baby they had. And they didn't have a problem with that, which is kind of interesting. That's a form of choosing a better self for the child you're having, rather than having someone born with depression or mental illness or a hole in the heart or something like that. I can't really see why people would have any problem with that. But further along, especially clear in terms of children, which I think will become an increasingly precious commodity, in a sense, to put it in economist terms, as population growth is continuing to slow down and people are having fewer and fewer children. I think we'll put more and more time into planning the best child we can have, and why not? So I think rather than just fixing, preventing problems, I think why not give your child good physical health and a sharp brain and musical capability and mathematical capability. And I personally would not want to give them just one of them, try and force it into my model of what I think a good person is. I want to give it all of them, and then so the child is gifted in every area, and then they can make a choice as to what they want to pursue. I am suspicious of parents who want to have a child exactly like the way they want it and fit them into a mold and give them music lessons and that kind of thing, because they have to be a musician. But I think enhancing all their capabilities, it's kind of hard to argue with that to me. So that's one area I think we're already seeing that is basically with children, and it will become more and more specific the changes we can make as we learn more about the technology. But in terms of ourselves, again, we're at a very crude level right now where we take drugs to affect our bodies and brains. You can make some pretty amazing transformations with steroids, right? If you take those, we have some incredibly huge people that couldn't exist in the past, but those have some downsides. We have very crude mood drugs right now. Again, I think as we learn more about the underlying biology, we can affect that at a more basic level. Instead of intervening in the biological process kind of in the middle, where we upset various things and cause some disturbances elsewhere, like antidepressants can have cause sleepiness or sexual dysfunction sometimes. If you can actually fix that at the root, then you can have a much better system. And I think in terms of kind of fundamental changes to human nature, I talked about how we have this kind of us and them mentality. We're also very bad at understanding our emotions. And there's biological reasons for that. If you actually look at the structure of the brain, there's a really good book called The Emotional Brain by Joseph Ledoux, which I recommend. He points out that if you look at the brain, what you see is all these connections going from basically the senses to the emotional centers of the brain and then to the cognitive centers. So basically it's designed or evolved so that saber-toothed tiger, feel fear, run. Right? That's a good mechanism because it saves your life, and so it gets built into the revolution. The trouble is today that doesn't work very well because we don't face saber-toothed tigers, we face very complex problems involving lots of people. And feeling fear drives people into very bad so-called solutions. And I think we're seeing, I can give lots of examples of that today. It might be controversial, but I think there's a lot of fear-based decision-making. And that's very hard to overcome. I think we can make progress culturally, but that's one of those things that's going to be hard to overcome as long as we have a brain that is preferentially designed to act on fear. And I think we need to better build new pathways, which in principle you could do with nerve growth factor, genetic engineering, various methods, even implanting synthetic neurons, like Ted Berker is working at the USC, where you could actually add new pathways in the brain that might allow you to understand your emotions better. Like right now, you might, many people often feel anxious or uncomfortable about something, and they think, why am I feeling like this? And they can't figure it out because you don't have good access to that part of the brain. But imagine you could really understand your feelings and motivations. You might realize, I'm being a bit of a shit here. I'm being unpleasant to that person because I feel insecure about that. Imagine you have much better insight. It might be harder to do stupid, unpleasant things if you really understand your behavior. So there's a lot of different areas like that where I think we're just at the very beginnings of the technologies that will allow us to choose ourselves better.
Interesting. So we have a question that stems off of this from a staff member, actually, that comes to the question of designing children for purposes of IVF. So the question is, does the potential for causing an increase in class stratification, inequalities and inequities in society give you pause on the idea of designing kids or giving kids additional capabilities beyond what would be normal?
Well, this concern comes up with every new technology, it seems. You can't have this technology because not everybody can afford it right away, and therefore it's going to increase inequalities. But if you think about the implications of that approach, then we really couldn't have any technologies at all, or only the ones that are extremely cheap and immediately available, which is almost none of them in practice historically. So I don't think that's a good objection to stopping this. What that means really is we should actually encourage innovation. We should remove barriers to these technologies so that they become cheaper quicker. And I mentioned the FDA. It's my favorite agency to hate. I can't stand the FDA. I think it's an appalling agency that should be abolished, at least cut back. Because what it does is it massively increases the cost of all kinds of health technologies, and it continually expands its empire. It's trying to control everything. Sometimes it battles with the CDC, who has the authority, but it's always expanding its power. And the more you regulate these kind of technologies, the more you slow down them going down in price. And if you think about one of the pretty low regulation areas of the economy is computers and mobile phones. And back in the 1990 or so, people would say, well, you can't. The problem with these technologies is all the rich executives will have these mobile phones and nobody else will. And they weren't even thinking about the kind of phones we have today, which are vastly better than what they were thinking of then. But now we see poor people have these. People in Africa even share them in villages and are actually jumping a whole generation of technology infrastructure. So I think the answer is not to be concerned about that, but not to stop it, not to restrict it, in fact, to speed it up, because that's the way that it gets spread to more and more people. And it's almost inevitable for technologies that are expensive that they begin for the few, and those people with more wealthy actually fund the extension of the technology so it becomes easy to produce in large numbers. And we've seen that in everything from automobiles to phones to whatever you can think of. The things that tend to stick with very expensive things are other things that are inherently expensive, like very large power generating systems, or things that are regulated by government very heavily, so you just can't get much competition there. So I think leave it open to innovation, and I think prices will come down fairly quickly.
That's very encouraging. So we have maybe about 3 more questions to cover. I'm just being a little bit conscious of time. We have 5 more minutes in the session. Do you have to go right at 5?
I got a little bit longer, but not too much. My wife's got another interview she's doing next door, so I need to cut off fairly soon then.
All right, sounds good. Then we'll try to plow through just a couple more. So I think the...
Oh, before we do, can I just talk to my wife? If you want a kind of introduction to transhumanism, this is going to come out backwards, okay. On Amazon's a little booklet, Transhumanism, What Is It? By Natasha Vidamula. It's a good, very short introduction. If you've got a bigger appetite, our big volume, The Transhumanist Reader, has dozens of essays by top thinkers, and my first essay kind of gives you a real overview of transhumanism, so I have to get my little commercial poke in there.
For sure, I have that second one. It's a great read. All right, so I want to stem off of the frustration that we have with the FDA and all of the assorted health regulators in other countries that are the equivalent of the FDA. They seem to operate based on what's called the precautionary principle, which underlies their whole philosophy. And you've previously proposed an alternative approach, which is the proactionary principle. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about what that means to you, and whether you see there being some hope coming in the future of there being a major paradigm shift away from the current approach towards this kind of new principle.
Boy, 2 minutes to cover this and stuff. Okay, so yeah.
Sorry, it's a heavy one.
The precautionary principle is actually embodied in the European Constitution, unfortunately, so people have to use this, and I think it's a terrible principle for decision making. It basically comes from the idea of the simplest form is look before you leap, but that's not really the way it works. It basically, if you boil it down to the reality of it, it basically says don't try anything for the first time. There's different versions of it, but essentially it says that any new technology or production method that's proposed, you have to prove that it's not going to harm human beings in any important way. Now, that's deeply problematic because, first of all, it's totally one-sided. It's just looking at the problems it might cause. It's not evaluating that on a cost-benefit analysis. It's not looking at the positive sides. And it's fundamentally flawed also because that's not the way we learn. We don't learn by sitting in our armchairs and figuring out how things will work out in the future. That's a very kind of Platonist idea of knowledge. I'm more with kind of the Aristotelian empirical view. You need to do stuff and figure out what's going on. So you can't just look before you leap. You've got to look while leaping and keep looking as you're leaping along, because you just can't. I mean, imagine even in 1980 trying to figure out the future of mobile phones. I remember when I was a teenager in Bristol going to an exhibit at the Museum of Video Phones, and that was like, wow, video phones, you can see each other. But we had no concept of all the apps and the GPS systems and all this other stuff you could do. So you can't really foresee how a technology will work out. The only way you can do that is to let people do it and keep proper laws of liability and so on, and obviously proper testing. People have informed consent, but you can't just shut things down because there might be problems. So that's kind of one motivation why I opposed the precautionary principle and developed the proactionary principle. We had a sort of online symposium a number of years ago where we had people like Marvin Minsky and Ray Kurzweil, and we talked about this stuff, and I ended up basically putting those thoughts together with mine and coming up with this new principle, proactionary principle, which starts from the idea that the freedom to innovate is extremely valuable to human beings. We wouldn't be where we are without the freedom to innovate. So that's the most important thing to protect. But then, and again, I can't go into detail on this, but if people want to check out on my blog, if you've got a strategic philosophy, you'll find blogs on this. I've got several posts from a few years ago. There are a lot of sub-principles which require us to rely not on public opinion or people's feelings, but on the best known methods for evaluating knowledge. And I go into some detail about that. And one that's particularly relevant to what we've been discussing, to treat human and natural risks equivalent. A lot of people say, oh, this is natural, so that's okay. Whereas if humans do it, it's somehow bad. Right? I say that's just nonsense. It's the bad outcomes that matter. It doesn't matter where they come from. So those have to be treated equally. So there's basically like 10 sub-principles which I can't really go into, but it's basically pro-choice, pro-freedom, but with very good decision-making processes to reduce the side effects and to learn as we go along. I think that's the only realistic way we can deal with new technologies and new options.
That makes a lot of sense. I hope that that paradigm shift comes in the not too distant future. So I want to.
Well, yeah, I didn't really address that, but I think there is some hope. Starting back in the 1980s to 90s, the first kind of chinks in the armor of FDA regulation on this came from the AIDS activists, who said, "Well, look, you're restricting progress with these new drugs that could treat AIDS, and people are dying." You can say, well, they might be dangerous. Well, I'm going to be fucking dead, you idiot. So let me try them. And there's a lot of stuff like that where they say, oh, it could have side effects. Yeah, well, otherwise I'm going to be dead. So it's kind of stupid. People need informed consent, but they need to make these decisions for themselves because these agencies are politicized. So that was kind of the first chink in the armor. And now with COVID, I think we've seen the same thing, especially when people realized that we actually developed the first vaccine in one weekend, right at the beginning of the epidemic. But it took a long time to go through all the processes of FDA approval. They didn't allow human challenge trials. We could probably never have had a second wave in the country, let alone third and fourth waves. But it was just incredibly slow because of that. I think those things may be starting to make some more people realize, well, there are some problems with this paradigm.
That makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to segue that actually into a question from a donor, which is pretty much the last question for us, except just one final one to end things. So this question is just generally, how do you think the world is going to look 10 years from now in the near future?
Oh boy, in 10 years? I'm not sure. I mean, there's so many different aspects of that, but I'm not sure I can really answer that. And right now I'm actually quite uncertain as to whether the next 10 years will be a lot worse or a lot better. It's I think we're kind of on the edge of either getting a lot better or a lot worse. I'm not sure which way we're going to go right now. So I'm a little pessimistic in that there's so much bad regulation of these technologies. There's a lot of political division and just bad thinking that I'm a little pessimistic. On the other hand, it's hard to predict. Sometimes things can flip very quickly. And looking at the influence of other countries, it depends on the direction they're going. Like China is looking a little bit bad right now. It looks like they're actually reimposing old-fashioned communism more. So that's not really a great sign. I don't really know. I'm not going to make a forecast for the next 10 years. I think in terms of the technologies we're talking about, I think despite the regulations, they will continue to advance. I think there's a lot of momentum there and a lot of interest in those. So even if it's not here, other countries will continue to do that. So I think we'll still gradual progress, not as fast as I'd like to see.
Makes a lot of sense. So there's one more question, just to end things off. This one's a little bit of a fun question. So In light of the idea of beyond human freedom of form and morphological freedom in general, and as the biotech needed for it becomes available, what do you personally want to be, and what is post-human Max More in the future?
Well, I don't know. I guess in terms of the army motto, I want to be all that I can be. But what is that? I'm not quite sure. It's hard to answer that question because what I want will change over time, no doubt. So I can only answer sort of generally. I think it depends on what kind of time frame we're talking about. But let's say we're talking about quite a few decades from now when we've beaten the aging problem, we have a lot more control over biology. I think that the intermediate term, which is the next couple of centuries maybe, I would like to be able to not be limited to this one human body, even if it doesn't age and it's very resistant to any kind of danger or damage. I have nanotech-laced diamond fibers in my skull so I can survive falling off a mountain or whatever. I would like to have the ability to transfer my mind, not my brain, but my mind, and that would be an argument about that as to how that's possible, into different bodies. It could just be telepresence or it could be actual transfer. I like to have different bodies for different purposes. I like to have an underwater body. I like to have maybe a body that doesn't look like any species that exists right now, that could have all kinds of different capabilities. I've always liked space travel, and I realize that these 8 bodies are really not good for space. They don't do well in space at all, so I might need a radically different body for that. So I guess the answer really is that rather than being any particular one way, I'd like to have a lot of options in terms of my physical form, and I'd like to have the option to shape my mentality, my cognitive structure, and my emotional structure the way I see. And I think I would, again, it's very hard to predict longer than that, because if I'm a lot smarter than I am right now, I know a lot more, had a lot more experience, I'm going to have a very different view of what I want to become, probably. So I can't really give a long-term view, but basically it's about more options, more experimentation. And hopefully being around other, on a social level, I look forward to living in a society very different from what we're in right now, a society of people who like to experiment and push the frontier. And whether that's on this planet or in a space colony somewhere, I don't know. But I would love to be part of forming a new society where we're a lot more open to exploration and discovery and initiative than we are in today's culture.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
And thank you to everyone who post some questions. So this session has been recorded and we'll post it afterwards for anyone who couldn't make it. So thank you again, and I think that's it.
Thank you, Noah. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Be well.